All right, so ladies and gentlemen, next we're going to look at a couple of models, a couple of equations that economists use to calculate gross domestic product. So we're going to start off with what's called the aggregate spending model. And this aggregate spending model looks at the spending on all final goods and services throughout an economy during a year here. So our gross domestic product is going to be equal to C plus IG plus G plus XN. You guys are going, by the end of this class, are going to know that equation quite well, and those four variables each mean something. So C means consumption. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is later. IG means gross private investment. G is equal to government spending. XN means net exports, which is also equal to exports minus imports. So we're going to take a look at all four of these components of the aggregate spending model of gross domestic product. So let's start off with consumption. So consumption is consumer spending on durable goods, such as cars, such as appliances. You have non-durable goods, like food and clothing and stuff that is not as durable as, say, cars or appliances. It's also spending on services, plumbing, college, accounting services, whatever it might be. Now, one thing that's something to take into account in terms of durable versus non-durable goods. I want you to think to yourself, which one of those types of goods would sales tend to dip the most in a recession during tough economic times? And it is the durable goods that are more likely to be able to say that are more likely to have sales dip in a recession. And the reason is during a recession, if you're lacking money, you're less likely to spend that money on a durable good. You, like a car, you might say, well, we can't buy that new car. We just gotta hold out. We gotta fix our car. We don't have enough money for a new car here. Appliances, etc. These type of goods, their sales are going to dip quite a bit in recession because you do not necessarily need to buy them. Non-durable goods, food, clothing, those kind of things, whether you're in a recession or they're in some sort of economic boom, and we'll be talking more about the business cycle later, non-durable goods you're going to have to buy. You need to buy food, you need to buy clothing, and you can't really hold on to them as well as you can durable goods. All right, so consumption, 2006, based on those numbers, you're looking about 70% of gross domestic product was consumption, about $9 trillion worth of consumption in the economy during that year. So consumer spending is the largest component of US GDP. Historically, about 2/3 of gross domestic product, 2/3 of our economy comes from consumption. We are a nation of spenders. If consumer spending falls in the United States, this ends up really hurting gross domestic product. All right, let's go on to IG, and IG is gross private investment. So gross private investment is spending in order to increase future output or productivity. So it is spending for something in the future. If you're spending for something right now, that is going to be consumption. But this spending to increase future output or productivity is going to be gross private investment, or IG. Sometimes it can be difficult to decipher between consumption versus gross private investment. But if we're spending to increase productivity in the future, it's gross private investment. If we're spending something right now to indulge right now, that is generally going to be consumption. So here's some examples. You have business spending on capital. Remember, capital is tools, factories, etc. New construction, for example, the construction of new homes that can be rented out, that would be included in gross private investment. Changes in unsold inventory. So businesses, when they produce things, the things they do not sell are going to be in inventory, and this change in unsold inventories is going to be a part of gross private investment. So in 2006, about 17% of our economy was gross private investment. About $2.2 trillion worth of gross domestic product there came from gross private investment, or IG. Now, let's move on to government spending. So government spending is all levels of government spending on final goods and services and infrastructure that count towards gross domestic product. In 2006, about 19% of our economy was gross domestic product, about $2.5 trillion. So if, for example, the government is spending money to build a road, that could be an example of government spending. One thing that does not count in gross domestic product that some think is included in government spending is transfer payments. So transfer payments are money from governments to households or to firms that the government does not get anything directly back in return. So for example, welfare payments, Social Security payments, which provides money to the elderly. These are transfer payments. They are money going to individuals without necessarily anything going back to the government in return. Mr. Vanderpool's paycheck could be a part of government spending, and it is not a transfer payment because Mr. Vanderpool is giving something back in return. He's teaching in return for the payment. But if the government isn't getting anything back in return, that is a transfer payment, and that's not going to be counted towards gross domestic product. Net exports. Exports minus imports is net exports in symbols, that is X minus M. Exports are going to create a flow of money to the United States in exchange for domestic production. So an export is going to be made in the United States. It's going to be exported, so we're going to lose the good, but we're going to bring in money. Okay, so there's going to be a flow of money to the United States in exchange for the production. Imports are going to create a flow of money away from the United States in exchange for foreign production. So an import is going to be made somewhere else. We're going to give up our money to bring in the import. So there is a flow of money away from the United States, and the production is coming in to the United States. So in 2006, we lost about $800 billion worth of gross domestic product, negative 6% of our GDP from net exports. United States imports more than it exports, so ultimately, if you take X minus M, it becomes a negative number. And it actually ends up hurting gross domestic product. Net exports numbers year after year after year will hurt U.S. gross domestic product. All right, so it's really important to know and to memorize those four components of the aggregate spending model. C is consumption, IG, gross private investment, G, government spending, and XN is net exports. Now, there is another model, another equation that is used that you sometimes see on the AP test, but it's not going to be used all that much in this class. So I'm going to talk about it. This is not as important as the aggregate spending model. And this is what is called the aggregate income model. Okay, so GDP measures spending and income. We already looked at the aggregate spending model. Now we're going to look at the aggregate income model. And these two should generally be pretty equivalent because one person's spending is going to be another person's income. Another way to think about it is that everything created is going to be sold, even if it is sold to itself. So an inventory would be, an increase in inventory would be a firm selling it to itself. So there's a couple of ways you can kind of equate spending and income. So income is going to be equal to R plus W plus I plus P, which is equal to factor payments. R is going to be equal to rent. Rent is the payment for natural resources. W is wages, which is the payment for labor. I is interest, which is the payment for capital. And P is profits, which is the payment for entrepreneurship. So we have the aggregate income, aggregate spending model. You need to be much more concerned about the aggregate spending model. I want to make that clear. Another very, very, very important topic is nominal versus real numbers, and particularly here, nominal versus real gross domestic product. Nominal gross domestic product is current gross domestic product measured at current market prices. Okay, so it is not adjusted for inflation, which is when prices are going up in the economy. It's not adjusted for deflation, in which prices are falling in an economy. It's unadjusted. So nominal GDP may overstate the value of production because of the effects of inflation. Real GDP is current GDP measured with a fixed dollar. It holds the value of the dollar constant and is useful for making year-to-year comparisons. So it takes inflation, it takes deflation, it takes changes in the price level into account. So real gross domestic product is adjusted, and it is generally considered the most important measure in terms of nominal versus real GDP. If you're going to compare numbers over time, you want to be sure to look at real numbers, including real gross domestic product. Let me give you an example in terms of movies to show you the importance of looking at real numbers. So Gone with the Wind was a movie that was made in 1939, made somewhere around $200 million in 1939. Now that $200 million is a nominal number. It is unadjusted. If you took that $200 million and you adjusted it and made it a real number, it made like billions of dollars, like $1.5 billion, something like that, which makes it one of the top grossing movies of all time. So and that's a real number. When you took the $200 million, which was nominal, you adjusted it for inflation, you got $1.5 billion. You basically went from a nominal number to a real number, and you can see, and you can actually compare Gone with the Wind to the movies that are being made today and how much they're pulling in. So you can see there that it's really important if you're going to compare numbers over time to use real numbers, to use numbers that are adjusted for inflation, deflation, changes in the price level. Real gross domestic product is the gross domestic product that is adjusted for changes in the price level. All right, so changes in GDP. GDP is a measure of a nation's prosperity and economic growth. As gross domestic product grows, the burden of scarcity is lessened for our society because as gross domestic product grows, there's more to be produced and there's more to go around. And GDP per capita or per person generally will provide a better measure of individual well-being than gross domestic product. So China has a pretty large gross domestic product. It's somewhere around $5 trillion, but when you divide it by the 1.3 billion people that live there, it's going to look like a lot less in terms of looking at GDP per capita. The United States, for example, has a larger real gross domestic product, and if you're looking at GDP per capita, it's being divided by less people as well. So it's important to make that distinction between GDP per capita and GDP per, and just general gross domestic product. All right, so let's do the assessment. So for number one, we're going to describe the four components of the aggregate spending model of gross domestic product. We're not looking at the aggregate income. So for example, consumption is one of the four components of the aggregate spending model of gross domestic product. So describe that, describe the other three as well. Aggregate spending model of gross domestic product. And then we're going to describe the difference between nominal and real gross domestic product. Which one is adjusted for price level changes and is therefore more accurate. All right, so for the summary here, in a paragraph, describe what you learned today. Remember, you can always pause and do all that good stuff, all right? So I will see you tomorrow, and I'll check these notes. You have a great evening. Bye-bye.